Thank you all for chiming in today and having me. So I'm a master's student at UNL in the School of Natural Resources, and today I'll be presenting on what's part of my ongoing master's work, which this presentation I've titled Importance of Scale in Evaluating Landscape Connectivity and Examination of Wetland Habitat in the Central Platte River Valley. So I kind of wanted to start off this presentation with some context and some background on landscape connectivity. So we're all talking about the same thing, because I think connectivity is a term that's pretty frequently used both in management and in research, and it's also a term that's evolved. So I think really my understanding is that it began as structural connectivity. So thinking about where is a given land cover type or a given habitat in a landscape. So are there large contiguous patches of a land cover type that's important for a given species, or are there many small isolated patches of that land cover type? So basically it's talking about what's the spatial configuration of habitat in a given area. Is it structurally connected? Is it contiguous or isolated? But that definition is limiting because many species of animals can move between habitat patches that aren't actually physically or structurally connected. So I think for that reason, connectivity has really now shifted to a focus on functional connectivity. So beyond that simply structural definition, and thinking about how does a given landscape impede or facilitate species movement? So how much habitat is there? Where is that located? But then also this behavioral component of how can species, given their dispersal capability or habitat preferences, move between these different patches of habitat. So functional connectivity is really the term that I'm employing today, and it will be the focus of the work that I've been doing. So why is this functional connectivity so important? And our study area was basically the Central Platte River Valley from Lexington to Chapman, shown in that map on the left. And this is really a highly fragmented landscape. The most dominant land cover type is cropland, corn and soy. And many land cover types that are important for a lot of species of conservation interests have both been reduced in their total area, but also have shifted into these smaller, more isolated patches. And when this happens, this fragmentation happens, there can both be physical barriers to species movement in the landscape. So something like a new development, that's really a physical barrier for a species moving between two patches of habitat. But there's also cases that this fragmentation, let's say the development of a new crop field, means that two patches of habitat are just simply too distant for some species to traverse that non-habitat matrix and move between those two areas. And that fragmentation, it kind of looks, the picture on the right is just kind of a random snapshot from, I think, maybe northeast of Kearney. The green patches are wet meadow on just a gray non-wet meadow background. So I think it just is a good illustration of what some of that fragmentation looks like of a habitat type of interest in this area. And I think that's pretty characteristic from wet meadow and for some of these other land cover types like mixed grass prairie or marsh in this study area. And the impact of fragmentation can be pretty varied. It can result in reduced migration and dispersal for species, reduced gene flow, and can make it more challenging for species to access the resources that they need to really sustain a viable population in these areas. So given, I think the three kind of key points that informed the direction of this project were first, this focus on functional connectivity. Second, this importance of evaluating connectivity in fragmented landscapes and why it's so particularly important in these areas. And then the third idea, I think, that sort of inspired this analysis is an interest in doing maybe a more systems level or a multi-scale analysis. So a lot of connectivity analyses are very species specific, which does make sense because species have different movement capabilities and habitat requirements. But it frequently means that I don't think we get a full understanding of how connectivity may vary in a landscape when we're so focused on a single species in this type of approach. So what we were hoping to do here was evaluate connectivity to Central Platte River Valley sort of with a broader lens and across these multiple scales. So thinking about how different groups of species who interact with this landscape differently and experience this landscape differently are experiencing connectivity. And I think this has largely not been explored in this type of analysis. So that was kind of the impetus for what we tried to do here. So the sort of confluence of those three ideas was our driving question, basically asking how does functional connectivity vary across scales in the Central Platte River Valley? I don't want to spend too much time on methods, but I do want to give sort of a summary of what the approach we took. So we wanted to identify groups of mammals that interact with the landscape basically in the same way. So we used a tested approach called a discontinuity analysis that basically evaluates the distribution of body masses of mammal species in the area and identifies groups of like species, so groups of species with a similar body mass. And because body mass is allometric with some animal behavior like dispersal, this also gave us a sense of groups of species that we could say interact with the landscape at a similar scale because they share this dispersal capability. So we ended up with groups of species ranging from something like the masked shrew on the left with a very limited dispersal capability up to species like a white-tailed deer or coyote on the right of this image, which really have a much greater dispersal capability. And so both of these species or groups of species are present in the Central Platte River Valley, but clearly are going to experience the landscape in a very different way, thinking about how they are able to move through that landscape. So that was kind of the first step of our approach. We then implemented a network analysis to actually examine connectivity in the system. So we started with land cover data from the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture, their 2016 Nebraska land cover data set. And we chose to focus on two land cover types for our analysis. The first was wet meadow and the second was emergent marsh. And we largely selected these because they are of conservation interest and they are utilized by many species in these areas, but also because they have a different spatial configuration in the landscape. Wet meadow, which is in part A of that figure on the left, there's greater habitat area. It's also clearly kind of more clustered along the Platte River itself. Emergent marsh on the right has a lower total habitat area and has you can kind of just visually see more small isolated patches in the study area. And so not all species clearly use these habitat types. Most species use a greater set of habitat, but given the broad scale of our approach, we decided that selecting just two habitat types that were sort of representative of different configurations would be a method to do this broader scale evaluation of connectivity. So once we identified the habitat types we were focusing on, we then basically converted these into non-spatial networks. So thinking about wet meadow, for example, each of those patches of wet meadow in the Central Platte became a node, like the little image that I've included on the right. So basically a point in a network. And then this is where those scales came in. So we wanted to develop a set of scaled networks for each of our land cover types that reflected how these different species interacted with the landscape. So for each of those groups of species we had previously identified, we found the mean dispersal distance for the species in that group. So then for the network for that group of species, that specific scale-specific network, two of those nodes or two habitat patches were connected if they were within that mean dispersal distance. So the mean dispersal distance of the smallest group of species that we found was 200 meters. So for that network, two nodes were connected by an edge, meaning an animal individual could move between those patches if they were within 200 meters of each other, and so on. So ultimately, we ended up with, for each land cover type, this set of scale-specific networks that more or less reflected how groups of species would be experiencing on the landscape and would be able to move through the landscape. And with those networks, we used a pretty common network analysis package in R called iGraph to evaluate some pretty common network metrics in this type of analysis. So to kind of orient everyone to this, it's kind of a summary figure. For each part, I'm showing results for both the emergent marsh and wet meadow networks. And those columns are colored by those dispersal distances that were representative for each group of species. And I want to highlight, I guess, a few different takeaways because there is a lot of information on this slide. The first is that there's a pretty clear pattern of connectivity of these land cover types increasing with scale. So in part A of this figure, that's showing degree centrality. And basically what that means is on average, how many patches of habitat are within the dispersal distance of a given patch in the network. So you can see at those short dispersal distances, the 200 meters and the 500 meters, the degree centrality is quite low. So there's not very many patches that are accessible basically from a given patch in the landscape. But as scale, or as those dispersal distance increases, there's this very clear increasing trend in degree centrality, which is basically a proxy for connectivity in this type of analysis. So connectivity is increasing with scale and is relatively higher for those species with greater dispersal distances. That same pattern is visible in part B of this figure, which is showing our results for modularity. And modularity is basically the strength of division in the network. So are there lots of clusters of nodes that are interconnected, but not connected to other parts of the network? Or are those connections, I guess you could think of it as more evenly distributed throughout the network? And again, at those small scales, we see it's highly modular, that y-axis on a scale of 0 to 1. And at those lower scales, highly modular, there's lots of kind of isolated clusters of nodes that are connected, but are not connected to a broader network. So the network is quite divided. A species with that dispersal distance would not necessarily be able to move very easily through this broader network. But that modularity basically drops to 0, which is the lowest possible, suggesting a highly connected network at all of those higher dispersal distances, telling us that a species with that dispersal distance would be able to move relatively freely through the network, not experience those divisions, and be experiencing higher connectivity. So I think kind of to summarize that, a first key takeaway is this clear increasing trend with connectivity across scale, which in many ways, I think is kind of intuitive, but helpful to really see the clear pattern here. The second takeaway I want to highlight with this figure is what sort of emerged as this threshold of connectivity between the 500 meter and 6,500 meter dispersal distances that we used. And this is present in several of the subparts of this figure, but I'll highlight it in part C. Part C is showing the number of components in these networks. And a component, I think I basically defined earlier, but is a group of nodes or a group of habitat patches that are interconnected, but isolated from the rest of the network. So at those shorter dispersal distances, there are many hundreds to thousands of these isolated components or node clusters. But at the 6,500 meter dispersal distance and above, those components disappear in the landscape. Telling us basically that a species in one individual habitat patch could access any other habitat patch in the landscape, given its dispersal distance, it's great enough to make that movement. So not only is there this increasing trend in scale, there appears to be this sort of key threshold between those two dispersal distances where the landscape really shifts from quite unconnected, reflected in that high modularity, the high number of components, to this really quite connected landscape where the number of components drops to about 0, and modularity also drops to about 0. Another way I think is helpful to think about these results is more spatially, because those networks really aren't spatial per se. So these two maps are of the wet meadow habitat on the left and the emergent marsh habitat on the right. A, B, C, and D are showing increasing scales or increasing dispersal distances. And the colors on the land cover types are showing degree centrality, which is again that number of connections for a given habitat patch or the number of other habitat patches that are within that scale specific dispersal distance. So if we just look at the figure on the left, part A, that's showing results for the 200 meter dispersal distance for the wet meadow network. And most patches of wet meadow have fewer than 100 connections, but there's also a number, and I know it's a little hard to see, of those really dark red patches, which are patches with 0 connections, 0 other patches within 200 meters of that patch. They're completely isolated in the landscape. So really that would mean that that habitat patch is not accessible from other areas of the landscape for species with that dispersal distance, or individuals within that patch would be quite isolated from this broader wet meadow network. But as scale increases through part B, that's that 6,500 meter distance, up to D, which is a 67,000 meter dispersal distance, those isolated patches really are eliminated, and degree centrality increases, I would say, massively, up to the point where there's a few thousand connections to other patches for every habitat patch in the landscape. So I think in many ways, this figure is giving similar information to the graphs in the prior slide, but I also do think it's helpful to give more of a spatial visualization of what these results really look like and highlight, I think, how substantially scale and connective, or how substantially connectivity increases with this increasing scale, which I think is it may be easier to see and visualize here. So I do know that I think in many ways this is a very kind of higher level, system level analysis. So I do want to tie it back to why is this cross-scale variation in connectivity that we've identified important in what we're actually doing in these areas. And I think I have a couple ideas. The first is just acknowledging that the effects of land management or habitat management are going to be influenced by species movement capability. And I guess to just take a really simple example with this mock network that I built on the slide again, let's say that that red node or red habitat patch is a newly restored patch of wet meadow habitat between these two existing groups or clusters of wet meadow habitat. So the distance of that newly restored area is from those existing habitat areas is really going to be key in how that new patch of habitat is going to benefit connectivity for different species. So if it's a few thousand meters away from existing wet meadow in the landscape, a species with very short dispersal distance really, in theory, is not going to be able to access that newly restored patch of habitat. But a species with a greater dispersal distance very well could. So for one species, it may not really be enhancing connectivity to the landscape, even though it's increasing the overall area of that land cover type. But for another species, it could very well act as a critical stepping stone between these two existing clusters of habitat. So this is sort of a broad picture analysis and presentation, but this is kind of just, I think, one way to think about it in the little example of how this variation comes into play in management, maybe is something to consider. A second thought or takeaway that's very connected to the first is that there is a substantial variation in connectivity in a landscape like the Central Platte. And I think, just as I was mentioning with the last point, this may suggest that a single species approach to land management or habitat management, or a focus on a set of very similar species in body mass or dispersal, may neglect others because there are these differences in how these species are interacting with this landscape and experiencing connectivity. So I think, again, similar to my first point, there's an importance in just recognizing these differences and taking them into account in management when possible. The third idea that I want to mention, and this is something that's emerged in some previous literature which have taken a similar approach to connectivity analysis, is what this potential threshold of connectivity means in the landscape. And what prior studies have suggested is that species with a dispersal distance close to that connectivity threshold, so in our analysis that was between 500 meters and 6,500 meters, could be most vulnerable to habitat loss. And I think this is because if you're already right at that threshold, the loss of some habitat area, if those are important patches, could be just what it takes to shift that threshold to the point where you are no longer on the top side of the threshold experiencing a highly connected landscape, and could maybe drop below that threshold to a relatively unconnected landscape. Our analysis here, I don't think provides enough information to really give really specific takeaways related to the threshold, because it is just focused on these two land cover types that are more representative as opposed to species specific. Got it. But I think it's an interesting idea to consider, and maybe an area that would be interesting to explore more with a more species specific analysis, given that we did see this pattern emerge in this project. So I do just want to briefly conclude and I think reiterate some of those potential next steps. So I think the clear takeaway maybe with this project was that there is this cross-scale variation in connectivity in this fragmented landscape, which is the Central Platte. And I think there is an importance of recognizing those scale-specific differences in connectivity and thinking about how we can acknowledge those and incorporate those into management. I think this project, or maybe how I'm thinking of it, is sort of a stepping stone towards maybe more species-specific analyses of connectivity in this specific area. Now that we've illustrated these patterns, maybe a species-specific analysis does have utility in identifying highly connected versus less connected areas of the CPRV and incorporating more of those species-specific dispersal distances and habitat requirements that, because this is kind of a broader analysis, when we were grouping species, we don't really have that super species-specific information. So with that, I did want to briefly acknowledge my co-authors on this presentation, who are also my thesis committee members at UNL, Dr. Allen and Beisch, as well as the NRT program at UNL that provides me funding support, and Andy Caven, who sort of helped spark some of these ideas and has continued to be very supportive. So, and thank you all for attending. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer questions now, and feel free to reach out via email at any time.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. Do you want to leave that slide up so that people can see your contact information?
Sure. Yes.
Fantastic. So we do have one question in the chat right now. Hold up. Let me stop.